Anybody out there ever failed at anything? All right, so everybody's hand should be up. If your hand is not up, then, well, God bless you. You don't really need to be here. You can just sort of scooch on out because, frankly, there's no reason to do church. You're pretty awesome. In fact, maybe you should go start a church and we'll just pack up and we'll all move over and figure out what you're doing right and the rest of us are doing wrong. But for the rest of us humans, failure is a part of life, isn't it? And failure is something that we all go through. Now, sometimes we don't respond so well to failure, but failure, if viewed in the right perspective, and if it doesn't crush us or kill us, it actually, we grow from it, don't we? We learn things about failure. Sometimes we learn that we lack skill sets. Some of us have had jobs that we've lost, or opportunities that we've lost, or relationships that have failed because we lack skill sets, right? I know what that feels like. And then when those kinds of things happen, you go to school, you learn the skill sets, you pick up you pick up the certification or the training or whatever it takes to learn the skill set to better yourself so that you can be successful the next time. For some of us, we learn about character deficiencies. Sometimes, we miss opportunities, or we make mistakes in our relationships. We fail in our relationships or jobs or things like that because we have character defects. We have things that need to be changed. We have attitude problems. We have, anger issues. We have bad relationship skills, all kinds of things. We're lazy. There's things in our life that sometimes need to be addressed and corrected. Sometimes we have to deal with our failure because we make mistakes. We just, we'd like to blame it on something other than ourselves. But we just sometimes make mistakes. We have bad judgment. We put our trust in the wrong people. We just sometimes do wrong things, and sometimes we do them intentionally, and sometimes we don't do them intentionally. Sometimes they happen to us, but we just make mistakes, and we have to face them, right? So all of those things, my goal in my life is I just don't want to fail the same way I failed before. I want to find all new ways to fail. I just want to be sure that each time I fail, it's from a different perspective. But the point of it is that if we understand failure, we grow from it, don't we? We're going to look at the life of Moses, and all of those things that I just described, he's experienced. And we're going to look at just a huge mistake that he made in his life and what God did with that. And we're going to look at it kind of from an unusual place. This is an Old Testament story, but it's in the New Testament. And this is Stephen, the first Christian martyr he's defending himself, and he's kind of walking through the whole history of Israel's redemptive history, and we're going to look at how he describes the life of Moses today. And we're going to learn some things about how we deal with faults, how we deal with failure, what do we learn from it, and what does God do with those times and those moments. And I think it's going to encourage a lot of us, because the reason it's so important is I see a lot of people in our culture that are paralyzed from failure. Failure shouldn't paralyze us. We should be able to learn from it, move forward on it, and even more importantly, see failure the way God sees failure. And I think if we can learn that, it will really help and encourage some of us. So let's pray together. God, I thank you for your presence in our midst. I thank you that we can sing some great songs of faith and life that speaks of the great plans that you have for each one of us. Strengthen each one of us today by your word and by your spirit, and help us to be more and more like you and more committed to the mission that you've called each of us to. Thank you for your presence in our midst and all the great things you do for us. Every good and perfect gift, your word tells us, comes from you. So we're grateful for that. We pray these in your name. Amen. If you have your Bibles, turn to the book of Acts. The book of Acts is the fifth book in the New Testament. The Bible is divided into two sections, the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Old Testament deals with the history and the narrative of Israel. The New Testament deals with the life of Jesus and the first 30 years of the church. And we're studying Acts, which deals with the history of the first 30 years of the church. It's written by Luke, who also wrote the Gospel of Luke. He traveled with Paul, so he knew the apostles, he knew the stories, he had experienced much of it, and so he wrote Luke. And Acts is written as sort of the follow-up, the second book of Luke, if you will. So it's best to see them as one unit. We're looking at the speech of Stephen. If you remember, Stephen was one of the 7 that was appointed to care for the widows in Jerusalem. He's been brought up on charges that he was speaking against Moses and against the temple, something which would be very serious in that culture. So he's standing before the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin is the highest Jewish court, and he's bringing his defense. And a big part of his defense, as we'll see as it sort of begins to unpack, is he's talking about the redemptive purposes of God through the history of the Israelites. And he's bringing this defense. So he begins with Abraham, through whom the promise was given that all the nations of the earth would be blessed. He goes to Joseph, who was the son of Jacob. And Joseph was the guy that brought the Israelites into Egypt. And then we're going to look today at Moses, who brought them out of Egypt. A big part of the narrative of Israel's history is the deliverance of them out of Egypt. It's so central to who they are as a people. And so we're looking today at the life of Moses. And in verse number 17, it says, as the time drew near to God to fulfill his promise to Abraham, the number of our people in Egypt greatly increased. So remember, it's kind of sometimes you got to kind of keep your mind focused. This is Stephen talking about the history of Israel. And what he says, what he's talking about is that time in Israel's history, they've been brought into Egypt through Joseph. Remember, Joseph was the son. We looked at him last week. He was sold into slavery by his brothers. Then he was betrayed by Potiphar's wife. And then 13 years of his life, from the age of 17 to the age of 30, he's either a prisoner or a slave. And then because he's able to discern God's will for Pharaoh and for Egypt through a dream, he interprets the dream and he's elevated to great status. He becomes the royal vizier to Pharaoh, the second in command. And through that prominence, he brought his family, 75 of them, into Egypt, and they began to prosper. For the first couple of 100 years, they're having lots of kids. They're prospering as shepherds. They live in the land of Goshen, and they're doing really extraordinarily well. But there's been a dynasty change. The Hyksos dynasty is now being supplanted by the powerful 18th dynasty of the ancient Egyptians. And this new Pharaoh, this new dynasty, doesn't know Joseph. Joseph has been dead for a couple of 100 years, and all they're seeing is this sort of migrant community, if you will, who's grown in great number and great status, and now this new Pharaoh is concerned about them. So this is what's happening in verse 17 as Stephen recounts the story. Remember that the history we're looking at this particular story happened 1,500 years before Stephen is giving the speech. So from our perspective, 3,500 years ago. From Stephen's perspective, 1,500 years ago. As the time drew near for God to fulfill his promises to Abraham, the number of our people in Egypt greatly increased. Then another king who knew nothing about Joseph became ruler of Egypt. He dealt treacherously with our people and oppressed our forefathers by forcing them to throw out their newborn babies so that they would die. What's happening here is this would be how ancient people would abort their children. In fact, in Roman culture, if you didn't want a baby, you just sort of took the baby out to the dump, and you just sort of left the baby out on the dump, and the animals and the elements would kill the little baby. And in fact, first century Christians, they saw it as their duty to go to the dumps and rescue these babies and raise them. I think it's a good lesson for us as Christian people. We don't like, and rightfully we object to abortion, but a big part of the solution is finding homes for these unwanted babies. And so this was part of how this culture would abort their children. And so what's happened is this new Pharaoh, 1,500 years before the story, part of their culture, this new Pharaoh orders the abortion of all of the baby boys that are born to the Jewish people. So they would take these little babies and they would expose them, mostly by putting them in the Nile River, but exposing them to the elements of the animals. And so this is a terrible edict that's gone out. You can imagine if you're a parent in that culture and you've been ordered to murder your baby sons. At that time, Moses was born, and he was no ordinary child. There's something extraordinary about Moses. His parents know it. Now, by the way, every parent thinks their children are extraordinary. Let me just assure you that we love your children, but most of our children are fairly normal like every other kid. But there was something unique about And now, I didn't just say that your children were not extraordinary. All of your children are extraordinary. But there really was something about Moses. So his parents understand that there's something divinely called about him. At least that's what the indication seems to be. For 3 months, he was cared for in his father's house when he was placed outside. When he was placed outside, what that means, when he was exposed, he was aborted as well. Now, this is so basically what they're saying is that he was raised in his parents' home, but his parents resisted the edict to murder their son, to abort their son. They don't want to do it. So they hold off for 3 months. Now you can imagine if you're the parents and you're trying to hide this little baby boy, your family would know, your neighbors would know. So pretty soon the neighbors are saying, hey, you got to get rid of that kid, or the Egyptian guards are going to come, and nobody. So they're pressured. They hold off as long as they can, but eventually they succumb to the edict to obey this terrible edict that they abort little baby Moses. And so the way they do it is they put him in a basket in the Nile River, and he's going to float off, and the snakes and the gators and all that will get him, or the elements, and it's this terrible thing. Now, before we're too judgmental on this, we have to remember that when people are pressed to in extreme situations, they are often forced to make terrible decisions. In fact, right now, Christians are being persecuted like they have never been persecuted. It's terrible. And there's stories of families, not just Christians, but other religious sects that are forcing, they're throwing their children off this. You've heard about these families that are trapped on these mountains, and they're throwing their children off of these mountains because they can't watch their little babies die of thirst or hunger, or even worse, to be killed by this terrible group ISIS. And so when people are forced to do terrible things, it's heartbreaking. This is where Moses' parents and their culture is. They're forced to do these terrible things. And so what they do is they are aborting Moses, something that is a terrible decision for them to make. And they put Moses in the river, but he's divinely and extraordinarily, miraculously saved. Some people speculate that the mother timed it just right and put the baby in the water where she knew Pharaoh's daughter was going to be, but there's just not the indication that happened. They just were going to fulfill the mandate by aborting their son, and God divinely rescued him. For 3 months, when he was placed outside, Pharaoh's daughter took him and brought him up as her own. Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and powerful in speech and action. By the way, I want to pause here just for a second, because one of the objections that people that attack our scripture will say, they'll look at some of these narratives, and particularly like the life of Moses, the life of Jesus, and they'll say, every ancient culture, every ancient religion has these sort of mythological stories of their heroes being born like out of a river or through a divine birth or something like that. And they'll often say this is the case with Moses. They'll look at this, they'll say, see, it's just sort of a mythological story of him being kind of miraculously brought out of the Nile. And although there's certainly some elements of God's divine hand, Stephen is not presenting this in any sort of mythological way, is he? This is a very practical, simple, kind of a human narration. He's just telling the story. The way he would say it in our own language, he would say, hey, there was Moses. Moses was born in a terrible time, a time when there was an edict going out to abort all of the male babies. His parents held on as long as he could, but eventually they aborted him as well, and God divinely rescued him. So there's no sort of mythological storytelling here to create Moses as something greater than he was. He's presenting him simply as a man who grew up in these very difficult circumstances in a troubling time in human history, and God miraculously saved him. And so I think it's an important thing when we look at the culture and the context to say these are real stories, these are real people, this is a real human narrative. Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptian, was powerful in speech and action. We're going to look here in a little bit. If those of you that remember the story, when God called Moses, Moses didn't feel like he was powerful in speech. In fact, God said, "You go to the Egyptians." He says, "I don't talk so good." He said, I don't have this power," but he did. One of the things that we're going to see with Moses is he learned great humility, and he learned it was something something that this prideful man changes, and that's what we're going to look at today. But he was known for his power in speech and power in action. Moses performed some extraordinary miracles. He gave the law. Anybody that's led anybody knows that you have to have some capacity to speak. Moses led several million people, so he was a powerful man. And particularly here at this place in his life where he's raised as the adopted son of Pharaoh. When Moses was 40 years old, what Stephen is doing with this is he's dividing the life of Moses into sections of 40, 80, and 120. So he's rounding these up. When Moses was 40 years old, he decided to visit his fellow Israelites. Even though Moses was raised and educated by Pharaoh, he knew who he was. His mother was brought in as a wet nurse. He would have known the religious practices and principles of the Hebrew people. He knew who the Hebrews were. He knew their culture. He knew all about them, and he knew that he was an Israelite, that he was not an Egyptian by birth. He saw one of them being mistreated by an Egyptian, so he went to his defense and avenged him by killing the Egyptian. So even though, now it's important to note that even though he isn't the adopted son of Pharaoh, he did not have the right to kill another Egyptian. He didn't have the right to kill anybody. So he broke the law. He takes the law into his own hands. He sees an Egyptian abusing an Israelite, and even though he might have felt vindicated in this, in that the Egyptian was abusing the person, and this is his fellow countryman, he was wrong. He sinned greatly. In fact, he would later write, when he wrote the law of Moses, that nobody had the right to take another person's life. But here he is taking the law into his own hands, breaking Egyptian law, and taking the life of another person. Moses thought that his own people would realize that God was using him to rescue them, but they did not. Now, when you look at the story as found in Exodus, what we find is he kind of sheepishly buried the body, hoping that nobody would find out. And then the next day, what happens the next day is, he says, Moses thought that his people would realize, but they did not. The next day, Moses came upon two Israelites who were fighting. He tried to reconcile them by saying, men, you are brothers. Why do you want to hurt each other? So what happened was that he saw the Egyptian and the Israelite. He kills the Egyptian. He buried the body. The next day, he sees two Israelites fighting, and he tries to say, hey, you're supposed to be working together here. You're on the same team. What are you fighting for? What are you fighting each other for? Now, what we find out, though, through this editorial is that Stephen is providing for us that there's a little bit more of the story to this. It's like he killed the Egyptian, he buried the body, and then he runs into these two Israelites, and note what they say. They say, but the man who was mistreating the other pushed Moses aside and said, who made you ruler and judge over us? Do you want to kill me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday? So it's almost as like the story that Stephen is telling is Moses is sort of saying, dude, I haven't even had time to brag about the fact that I killed this Egyptian. Nobody's supposed to know about this. But he's thinking that people are going to say, yay, Moses is our great deliverer. He's doing this great job. But they didn't. These two Israelites heard about it, and they say this is a bad thing. Who appointed you ruler and judge? When Moses heard this, he fled to Midian, where he settled as a foreigner and had two sons. So here's the picture, this picture of a guy who was raised in affluence, that felt that he had an entitlement. He took the law in his own hands. He killed another man. He thought his crime was going to be celebrated. So he thought his crime was going to be celebrated by the Hebrew people, by the Israelites, but that maybe the Egyptians wouldn't even find out about it. What happened was both things were wrong. The Egyptians did find about it. We read in Exodus that Pharaoh was out to get him and wanted to put him to death for the crime. And then we also find out that the Israelites rejected him. They said, you're not our ruler and judge. Who do you think you are? So he ends up getting rejected by both people in his culture, the Egyptians and the Israelites, and he runs away. He goes to this little desert town called Midian. So now think about this. Here is this great leader raised as one of the sons of Pharaoh himself, and now all of a sudden he has to go to this little cow town in the desert, and he becomes a shepherd. Now, shepherds in Egyptian culture would have been seen as the lowest rung on the socioeconomic ladder. They were the lowest of the low. So what happened in Moses' life, it's sort of like a guy being the CEO of a Fortune 500 company, all of a sudden washing dishes at Denny's. By the way, if you're a dishwasher at Denny's, any work is good work. Don't have any shame in that. But this is what it would be like. He's been seriously, he's taken a big hit to his status and position in life. And on top of that, he's living this sort of quiet, humble life. What the story actually is when he comes into Midian, he comes to this well. There's these daughters, these shepherdesses who are trying to water their flocks. There's some hoodlums that are keeping them from doing that. Moses beats up the hoodlums and lets the girls have their water, and then he gets to marry one of the girls. So it's kind of this Hollywood sort of picture. And he gets the girl, and he ends up living for the next 40 years as a shepherd and as a father and as a husband. A far, far cry from where he's come as one of the sons of Pharaoh. After 40 years had passed, an angel appeared to Moses in the flames of a burning bush in the desert near Mount Sinai. Now, when you read the account in Exodus, it's kind of interesting in a way because he sees the burning bush, but what happened, he says, what really draws his attention is the bush is burning, but it's not being consumed. So there's something interesting about that, and I've reflected a lot on this down through the years. If I were Moses, and I'm thinking to myself, man, I was the son of Pharaoh, man. I had servants for my servants. I'm the big cheese around here. And all of a sudden, these stupid Israelites betray me. The Egyptians want to kill me. I have to haul it over to Midian, where I become a shepherd. That sucks. And now I've got married. I got these two bratty kids, and I don't like my life, and I'm stuck in this little cow town, Midian, and all of a sudden there's this burning bush. I don't even care. Just burn the whole place down. That would be me. Aren't you glad I'm not Moses? But what is interesting is that even in the process of his status being seriously compromised, he still is open. There's something he sees, something he discerns about this bush, and he goes and he investigates. And I tell young people, I use this story a lot when I talk with young people, and it's applicable to older folks too. Keep your heart open. If you live your life expecting the supernatural, you will see it. But we have to learn to keep ourselves in a posture to expect the miraculous, to expect the divine, to expect the supernatural. This is sort of the idea we get with Moses. But note this. When he saw this, he was amazed at the sight. As he went over to look more closely, he heard the Lord's voice. I am the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Moses trembled with fear and did not dare look. So he remembered God. He knew who God was. Even though he'd been educated in the palaces of Egypt. 40 years later, he still knew God. When the Lord said to him, take off your sandals, the place where you're standing is holy ground. I have indeed seen the oppression of my people in Egypt. I have heard their groaning, and I've come out to set them free. Now I will come, I will send you back to Egypt. And one of the things that I think is interesting about this would be a strange thing for God to say. When you read the Exodus account, where it's more detail, there's a lot of detail in God's response to Moses, rather. You almost get the sense that this had been something that Moses had been praying about. Otherwise, it'd be a strange thing for God to be answering. It would be strange for God just to say, hey, I'm concerned about the nation of Israel. The response that God has given is almost as if this had been a repetitive prayer, a constant prayer of Abraham. Whether that's sort of reading into the account or not is probably a little of that, but you get this sense that Moses is at least sharing God's concern for the people. And God is responding to that. And again, I've put myself in that position. Remember that according to Stephen, Moses killed this Egyptian hoping that the Israelites would see him as their savior, their rescuer. So then I'm thinking to myself, if I'm Moses, again, we should all be going, glad you're not Moses, but if I'm Moses, I'm thinking to myself, those stupid Israelites, they're the reason I'm out here in the first place. They should have seen me as their hero. It's because of them I got to tend all these sheep. I got married to this Midianitess. I got these two bratty kids, and I'm stuck here in Midian. And then when God says, hey, I want you to be the deliverer of them, you're like, finally, I thought I was pretty awesome 40 years ago. You're finally seeing it. Thank you. But you don't get this sense from Moses. He's very humble. In fact, in the Exodus account, he goes, no, that's not me. God has to keep persuading him. God, 3 times Moses objects, and God gives him the promise of a miracle. Here's how they're going to know who you are. Here's how they're going to understand that I'm sending you. Here's the authority I'm sending you with. You see this real reluctance. And one of the things I think we can infer from that is through all of those 40 years, you don't see any there's no sense that Moses was plotting his comeback, trying to achieve the great status he once had a bitter heart because of how far he'd fallen. You don't see any of that. You see a guy that fell from one of the highest rungs of the social economic ladder to one of the lowest, and yet lived with humility as a father, as a husband, as a shepherd, and found great contentment in that. In fact, you don't see, there's no sense at all that he had bitterness in his heart. His father-in-law, Jethro, loved him. They had a good relationship. He stayed married to his wife and stayed faithful to his sons. Somehow he found contentment in 40 years of being a shepherd in Midian. God says, now come, I will send you back to Egypt. In verse 35, he says, this is Stephen again saying, this is the same Moses whom they had rejected with the words, who made you ruler and judge. He sent to be their ruler and delivered by God himself through the angel who appeared to him in the bush. He led them out of Egypt and did wonders and miraculous signs in Egypt at the Red Sea and for 40 years in the desert. Stephen is saying, that's the same guy. That arrogant, brash Egyptian who took the life of another man. That's the guy God raised up. And I think there's a couple of things that we can kind of pull from this. I think one of the most important is to understand the context. The context in which we read this story is Stephen's speech. And the whole purpose of Stephen's speech is to lay out the redemptive narrative or the redemptive purposes of God. What I mean by that is God's plan of salvation for all humankind and how it began with a mandate given to Abraham 2,000 years before Jesus and 4,000 years from our time. The promise that through Abraham, all the people of the earth will be blessed. The promise that God was going to deliver his people through Joseph. The promise that God was going to take the people out of Egypt through the leadership of Moses. In that context, each of these stories are best seen through God's redemptive lens, how God is going to save the world. Last week, we looked at Joseph and how Joseph's suffering. Joseph, again, you remember, he didn't deserve that. He was a bratty kid, but he didn't deserve to be sold into slavery. He didn't deserve to be betrayed by Potiphar's wife and spend the next several years in jail. He didn't deserve that. That was done to him, and we looked at his suffering through the lens of God's redemptive purpose, and Joseph himself said, what you meant for bad, God meant for good so that people could be saved. So Joseph saw his life through the lens or through the perspective of God's redemptive work. Moses teaches us something similar because Moses also viewed his life through the lens of God's redemptive purpose. Moses was a different situation than Joseph, though. Joseph didn't do anything to deserve that. He didn't make any mistakes. He didn't fail in that sense. Moses did. Moses killed a guy. Moses really blew it. And because of that, he had to flee to this desert community where he lived far below the standards he'd enjoyed in Egypt. And you can look at the life of Moses from several different perspectives of his failure. You can look at it and say, well, there were certainly things, and I've heard a lot of messages preached on that. It might be a little bit of a stretch, but skill sets maybe that he didn't possess. He went to be a shepherd, and a lot of people have kind of speculated maybe he learned some skill sets as a shepherd to be able to lead the nation of Israel. There's probably something true about that. The nation of Israel traveled with hundreds of thousands of heads of sheep and cattle and hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of sheep and cattle that they used for the sacrifices. So certainly there was some agricultural things he needed to learn. He learned about leadership. He learned about what it meant to be an entrepreneur and to run a business and to lead workers and things like that. He learned some things. Whether he had those skill sets or not, who knows? But he learned some things about how to lead people. Certainly, we can say this. He understood that he had some character defects. He acted in extraordinary pride to take the life of somebody when you know you're not supposed to. And then also to have this elevated sense of yourself. Oh, the people should see that I'm their great deliverer, even though they didn't see it that way. That way, you see this prideful Moses at the beginning of the story, but after his 40 years in the desert, a very different man came, a very different man, a man that had learned humility. In fact, at one point it was spoken of him that said he was the most humble of all people. He learned humility. By the way, he still struggled with his pride. One of the final stories of Moses' life was a time when he was supposed to speak to the rock to produce water, but instead of speaking to it, he struck it in anger. And his anger and his pride once again got the better of him. And because of that, he wasn't able to go into the land of promise. So this was, which should, by the way, encourage us. If this great man of faith still struggled with issues of sin, we're going to still struggle with stuff. It means we have to be vigilant. We have to be aware of the weakness and the frailty of our humanity. But there's no doubt that Moses is a different guy. He's learned humility. He's seen that character defect, and he's dealt with it. Even more importantly, God has dealt with it. He's a different guy. But I think the most, and then you have this to me, the most compelling aspect of it is he's accepted his failure. He's understood it. He knows he made the mistake. He knows he should never have killed that guy. And even though he's kind of framed it up, and he kind of had it framed up in this way, he's a different man. And you don't see a bitter guy. You don't see an angry guy. You don't see a guy that's resenting his family and his children and his occupation. He's learned to find joy in it. He's living this quiet, humble life as a shepherd, a husband, and a father. But the most extraordinary aspect of it to me is how this story is to best be seen from the perspective of God's redemptive purpose. Stephen is saying that's the guy God raised up. This deeply flawed man who made a terrible mistake but learned and grew from it. In spite of this terrible sin, that's the guy God raised up. Now, the overarching meaning of this speech is that you rejected that guy. But I want to focus and just pause on that. Because, see, I see a lot of people in the church that say, well, I can't be used by God because of X, Y, Z. I did this, or I did that, or I'm living in this way, or such and such. God can't use me. I'm off the table. Draw a line through my name. X. Can't be used. But if God can use a prideful murderer like Moses, I don't think anybody here has killed anybody, have you? Don't tell me. Tell somebody else. If God can use that person, God can use that. Because, see, here's what God does. God takes everything. We don't get ourselves kind of fixed up so God can use us. He takes everything. He's going to take your faults. He's going to take your character defects. He's going to take your mistakes. He's even going to take your sin, the things that you've done wrong, that you've done willfully wrong. He's going to take all of those things, and if you allow it, he's going to form you in the way that he wants you to be formed. Moses was just the simple guy learning to deal with his faults and his failures, living humbly as a shepherd, a father, a husband. Then he sees this burning bush, and everything changed. This deeply flawed man became the man that God raised up. The Apostle Paul, who was also a deeply flawed man, would write in a similar way. The Apostle Paul was the guy, in fact, here in a few weeks, we're going to look at when Stephen is actually stoned to death and killed. And Paul, his name was Saul at the time, he was actually there holding the garments of the people that are killing Stephen. He was a great persecutor of the church. He was a murderer himself. But he'd been given extraordinary vision by God. God told him things. God revealed things to him that he didn't reveal to anybody else. And he's writing about it in 2 Corinthians 12 And in verse number 7, here's what he said. To keep me from becoming conceited because of the surpassing great revelations, there was given to me a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. Now, Paul wrote this 2,000 years ago, and people have been debating for 2,000 years what that thorn in the flesh is. We still don't know what it was. Some theologians speculate it was a sickness, a disease, a deformity. Others speculate maybe it was an issue in his life that he never brought resolution. Maybe he felt the guilt of all the people he'd persecuted and imprisoned and killed. Maybe he had an area in his life that he was having a hard time controlling, pride, anger. We don't know. There's all kinds of things we can speculate. What we can say is he was human. We all suffer from a common affliction. We're human. Paul was too. He said, 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it from me. 3 times. Now, if the great apostle Paul that formed up the theology of the church, which we still honor and we still read and we still learn today, 3 times asked God to take something from us, and God didn't, that means that when we pray for things for God to remove from us and God doesn't, whether it's an infirmity, a sickness, a condition of our finances, a problem, some challenge, an issue that we can also learn from these things. If Paul had them, we can take some confidence that we have them too. But we can learn and we can grow. So Paul, like Moses, he's not trying to sort of somehow pull himself up by his bootstraps and get it all put together so that he can be used by God. In fact, what we're going to read is he embraces the weakness. Whatever it is, we don't know what it is. He says, therefore, I boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses so that Christ's power may rest in me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weakness, in insults, in hardships, in persecution, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. It's the counterintuitive thing of our faith. Too much in the Western world, we think, if I could just make myself awesome, God can use me, but it doesn't work that way. God uses the foolish things of the world to confound the wise, is what Paul would say. Everything in our life as people of faith is counterintuitive. If you wait to get yourself all strengthened up and all super awesome, then God's going to use you. You've got it backwards. Allow God to use you in your weakness, in your brokenness, in your insufficiencies, in your faults, your character defects, your flaws, even in the mistakes you've made, in your failures. Allow God to move in that. It's almost like God wants to say, I want to really show you something, but I'm not going to show you something until you stop trying to show me something. You're not going to show God something. Let God show you something. This is what's happening in the life of Moses. This is what's happening in the life of Paul. Broken, flawed men who understood that in their weakness and in their humility, that's when God moves. Now, I don't know where everybody in this room is. I know a lot of your stories, and I know a lot of what you're going through now and what you've been through, and I also know that we're human, so there's more things coming, right? Look to your neighbor and say, it's coming. You know, we're going to go through stuff. But whatever you're going through, wherever you are, those are those times and those are those seasons when God works. In your weakness, that's where he's the strongest. So whoever you are, whatever you're doing, let's learn from Moses. What did Moses do? He didn't allow his heart to grow bitter. He wasn't resentful towards the people that ran him off, either the Egyptians or the Israelites. He wasn't bitter. He wasn't resentful. He lived quietly. He lived humbly. He was a good father. He was a hard worker. He was a good husband. He did the right thing. And he did it for 40 years. Success is when you do the right thing for a really long time. Young people, remember that. There are no shortcuts. Success happens when you do the right thing for a really long time. And then you'll get somewhere. If you find yourself in that season, there's so much good to be said about just putting your head down, being a faithful person, be a good husband, be a good wife, Be a good father. Be a good mother. Be a good friend. Be a good brother or sister. Love the people you're around. Work hard. There's no job that's below you. Whatever you're doing, do it with all your might, the Bible says. Put your back to it. Do it well. Take pride in what you're doing. Learn humility. Learn humility. Bible says that God resists the proud. You don't want God putting his shoulder into you. I know, he's done it to me. It super sucks. Live with humility. Be faithful. And do that until you see a burning bush as well. Because when you expect the divine, when you expect the supernatural, it will happen. You got it? That's the story of Moses. God bless y'all. Have a great weekend.
Running, 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 running. Oh, just to know.